So it's official, the summer season of anime is almost upon us. And with the summer season of anime rolling in, we have some massively huge heavy hitters coming down the pipe. Now, the two biggest anime coming in this summer season are obviously JJK Season 2 and Part 2 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc in Bleach. Now, ironically, even though JJK was based off the likes of Bleach, these two upcoming seasons from these two respective shows could not be more different. See, while JJK Season 2 focuses on the backstory of Gojo and Geto and builds out the lore of what's going on in the JJK universe and the motivations of all the bad guys, Part 2 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc is essentially just a 12-episode battle. Very little happens plot-wise, a whole lot happens fighting and killing-wise. That's not to say that nothing happens plot-wise. In fact, a couple of very important things do happen in Part 2 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc. However, since tybw was rushed into completing Bleach, unfortunately, a couple of those things that happen that are very important are kind of hard to understand. See, unfortunately, tybw was rushed by his producers to finish Bleach as fast as possible because Bleach's star was waning. And therefore, even though tybw wanted to introduce incredibly complicated and beautiful powers, all built on an incredibly fleshed out backstory, he had to skip some of the fluff, going so far as to elect to kill some people off screen so he doesn't have to worry about finishing their stories. Now, unfortunately, this does lead a lot of people to not super love the ending of Bleach, but fortunately for us, because of light novels and extended universe releases, we pretty much know everything we can know about the 1000-Year Blood War arc. However, unfortunately, a lot of that information doesn't come from the anime or the manga. And fortunately for you, I know all of that information. So with Part 2 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc coming out in just a couple of days, today we're going to be covering everything that you need to know before heading into Part 2 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc. And even though I've said that it's basically just a 12-episode fight, there is a good amount you're gonna want to know. Like, who is the Quincy King really? What is his backstory? What are his powers? How do they work? How is he getting stronger? What does Ichigo's power-up really look like? Why did he get it in the first place? How did Renji and Rukia get so much stronger? What is Squad Zero? And so much more than just that. But before we get to answering all those questions and more, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, hit that noti bell. And if you like the idea of me keeping you up to date on all things anime, then you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So Bleach is back after its multiple-year hiatus. We were finally given the 1000-Year Blood War arc, which many regard as Bleach's best arc, though unfortunately rushed. And Part 1 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc truly lived up to that hype. Between the epic battles and the incredible animation, it is truly the best Bleach content we've ever gotten. And the second part will continue to live up to that hype. But before we get to talking about what we're going to be expecting from Part 2 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, I'd like to make a quick recap on where we currently are in the story. See, the 1000-Year Blood War arc, even though it was rushed, is a long arc, spanning from chapter 480 to 646, the end of Bleach. And the pace at which the anime is hauling through this content is legendary. In simply just 12 episodes in Part 1 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime, we covered 62 chapters of content. Meaning, for those of you who are impatient and want to read ahead, the chapter that we're currently on, that is to say the first episode of Part 2, is 542. So to reiterate, Part 1 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc covered from chapter 480 to 542. Almost 5 chapters an episode. In fact, it's technically more than 5 chapters an episode. Now, at that current expenditure, the 1000-Year Blood War arc would only be about 24 more episodes. And technically, that would kind of make sense. Part 2 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc is probably going to bring us to roughly around chapter 600. And in chapter 600, there's a huge tonal shift in terms of the story and who the opponents are. And saving that for the last 12 episodes of the 1000-Year Blood War arc would actually play pretty well. However, Part 2 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc is going to be slightly different than Part 1. See, because while Part 1 was a strict adaptation of the manga, in order to not haul through the content too fast, Part 2 is gonna have some anime-only fights. Now listen, I know what you're saying,
Nick, that sounds a lot like filler.
and technically you're not wrong. It will be filler, but only filler in the capacity that it doesn't exist in the manga. See, the reason that we know there is going to be some anime specific fights is because of something that we saw in the trailer we were given. Specifically, that Shinji was in a battle against 20 Stern Ritters and unleashes his Bankai. And while technically this never happens in the manga because Shinji never releases his Bankai in the manga, this doesn't mean it didn't necessarily happen in the manga. See, Shinji is kind of present between chapters 540 and 600. He's involved in a lot of fights, but he's never the main fighter in a fight against a Stern Ritter. And therefore, the possibility that Shinji is somewhere off camera battling against Stern Ritters isn't crazy. On top of this, technically this moment isn't as filler as it could be. Because while technically Shinji unleashing his Bankai never happens in the manga, it does happen in a light novel that was released about 4 years ago, I believe. And we learn in this light novel that the reason that Shinji never releases his Bankai is because his Bankai affects everybody, allies included. See, for those of you who have read or watched Bleach, you'll know that Shinji's Shikai has the ability to reverse the senses of anybody who he's battling, which means he can basically flip your vision, your hearing, your taste, everything upside down, making it almost impossible to move unless your name is Aizen. However, Shinji's ability isn't the ability to reverse somebody's senses. It's just reversal. And Shinji's Bankai takes that to another level. See, Shinji's Bankai, which goes by the name of Sakashima Yokoshima Hapa Fusugari, reverses the idea of friend and foe in your brain. And therefore, anybody within his Bankai's range will begin attacking the people who were their friends just a second ago. Now, obviously, Shinji isn't affected by this. He creates a fire flower that keeps him protected from it. And in the light novel, Shinji uses this Bankai against a literal sea, thousands of Erhukas level hollows, who upon, after being placed under the effects of his Bankai, tear each other apart. Now, because Shinji's Bankai works on everybody, it's been banned. However, we know from the trailer that Shinji is going to find himself in a battle against 20 Stern Ritters simultaneously, a battle in which he will be alone and therefore able to unleash his Bankai. But as to whether or not there will be other anime-only fights, we don't really know. Most likely, I assume there won't be, because like I've stated already, chapters 540 to 600 are basically just wall-to-wall fights. But there are some rumblings that state that Oryu will actually be more heavily focused on in the anime than he was in the manga. Because as anime-only fans know, Oryu in the last episode of part 1 decided to join the Wunderreich. But we also know the reason Oryu joins the Wunderreich. And this is because when Oryu was digging through some research materials, he stumbled upon the real reason his mother died, which for those of you who don't remember happened when Yawahaba woke up and decided to purge the earth of all Quincy's he believed were impure. And since Oryu's mother wasn't technically a pure-blooded Quincy, she was decided to be impure. And we know this happened 9 years ago when the Quincy king recovered his strength. Specifically, he used a technique known as Oswalin, which ended up killing every Gempshed Quincy. Now, for those of you who don't remember, there's two types of Quincy's on Earth, the Gempshed and the Echt. Those who descended from a long line of Quincy's were considered Echt Quincy's. And Echt is just German for pure-blooded, while all other Quincy's that weren't considered pure-blooded were considered Gempshed, which is German for mixed. Surprise, surprise, the Germans fall into eugenics once again. Yahuwah is able to do this because he is technically the progenitor of all Quincy's on Earth, and therefore he's able to control the energy and life force of all Quincy's. And after her death, Ryokin, Uryu's father, did an autopsy on her and found that there was a piece of silver that caused a clot in her blood that killed her. This clot was brought along by the Oswalin, and Ryoken forged this silver clot into an arrowhead with the intention of firing that arrow through the heart of Yawahaba. But unfortunately for Oryu, Yawahaba isn't that dumb. See, Yawahaba knows why Oryu joined up, to get revenge for his mother, and therefore he decides to actually name Oryu his successor, which makes Oryu the least popular person in the Wunderreich, gaining him the animosity of every single Stern Ritter who believed that they were in a better position to become the successor. On top of this, when being indoctrinated into the Wunderreich, Oryu takes some of Yahuaba's blood and consumes it, which is a ritual all Quincy's have to undergo before joining the Wunderreich. And that's a problem, because Yahuaba's abilities work kind of weird. While every single Quincy on Earth has the ability to control and pull in Reishi, Yahuaba's abilities actually work in a somewhat opposite manner. See, Yahuaba was born a prodigious child. A child, when touched, would heal the ailments of whoever touched it. Missing an arm? Not anymore. Missing an eye? Not anymore. Are you sad? Not anymore. However, he was also born an incredibly scarred and broken child, without the ability to touch, smell, sense, see, hear, anything. However, as more people touched this child and went on living their now fulfilled life, after a couple of days, or a couple of months, or a couple of years, they would all inevitably die. And yet people from all across the globe continued to flock to Yahuwaba's body in order to cure their ailments. And slowly but surely, as these people who touched him and were cured died, Yahuwaba began to get his senses. As his eyes opened for the first time and his ears heard for the first time, Yahuwaba and everybody around him realized something. Touching Yahuwaba heals you, but it also binds your soul to him. And therefore, when you die, your soul returns to him and heals him. And therefore, even though Yahuwaba abhors violence, in order to remain functional and alive, he has to constantly kill those around him whom he shared his power with. And thus, even when Yahuwaba loses a Stern Ritter, it's really not the end of the world. In fact, he himself cuts down a good amount of them, because the second they die, their power is returned to him. And their death grants him the ability to not only be stronger, but also to see and hear and taste and feel. But Yahuwaba actually found a way to increase the power of this power. You see, in part 1 of the 1,000-Year Blood Walk, you'll remember that all of the Stern Ritters had letters, and their letters were associated with their power. This is actually something Yahuwaba found out when he was relatively young. He found if he assigned letters to people, the powers he could give them went far beyond just fixing somebody's arm. He could give them powers beyond human comprehension. Powers like the ability to convert anything their reishi touches into a bomb. Powers like the ability to be able to revive yourself endlessly so long as there's a crowd cheering for you. Powers like the ability to make anything you imagine reality. So long as Yahuwaba shares part of his body and gives you a letter, you can have powers beyond comprehension, which means that all of the Soul Reapers in the Serete need to get massive upgrades and quickly. See, there are so many battles between Soul Reapers and Stern Ritters in these 60-ish chapters part 2 is going to cover, that if I was to sit down and actually describe the powers of every Stern Ritter that we're going to see in this part 2 battle, the video would be 45 minutes long. I mean, at some point in time, I will do a all Stern Ritters ranked and explained video, but that is a video in itself. And so is describing all of the ways that every Soul Reaper in the Serete got stronger between part 1 and part 2. Because as we know, Rukia, Renji, and Ichigo are all in the Soul King's Palace, also known as Ryoku. In the Soul King's Palace, they're learning from the 4 Royal Guards, who I've actually done an entire video on, but I'll describe who they are and what their abilities are here briefly. I'm sorry, there's actually 5 members of the Royal Guard. And those 5 members of the Royal Guard defend all cardinal directions of the Soul King Palace, being that east, west, north, and south. And then there's Ichibe, who is the leader of the Royal Guard and doesn't have a cardinal direction assigned to it. The first member from the Royal Guard we'll talk about is the first member that you've met. His name is Tenjiro. He's the Divine General of the East, but also known as the Demon of the Hot Spring. He, like every other member of the Royal Guard, was invited to the Soul King Palace because he invented something that changed the Serete. And the change that he enacted was the creation of the White Bone Hell and the Blood Pond Hell, 2 hot springs that were able to completely heal anybody who was cast into them and also refill their body with the likes of Ryatsu and blood. So essentially 2 hot springs that can cure you from any injury. Tenjiro is probably the greatest healer in Soul Reaper history. However, he's also an incredibly powerful fighter, as he also wields a weapon known as Kinpika. However, as to what the abilities of his Zanpakuto are, we're not entirely sure. We know that he has the ability to unleash massive amounts of boiling water at his enemies, boiling water that boiled away dozens of Stern Ritter foot soldiers. But outside of that, we don't know much about his abilities. The second member of the Royal Guard we're going to talk about is Kiryu Hikifune, who's the Divine General of the South, also known as the Ruler of Grain. She was invited to be a member of the Royal Guard because she created the Gikon, which she did as the leader of the research team in the Gotei 13. And the person who took over after her was Kisuke Urahara. She's known as the Ruler of Grain because she's able to cook food that can refill your Ryatsu. And therefore, by combining her Ryatsu refilling food with the blood and the bone baths, you can basically recover from anything. However, since she is technically the Ruler of Grain and therefore can manifest her abilities through food, she's technically able to control anything with her Ryatsu, as anything can kind of be considered food, and therefore she's able to funnel her Ryatsu through the means of pretty much anything. Now, unfortunately, the only way we ever see her use her Ryatsu was through something known as the Cage of Life, which is a cage made out of a tree that she creates using her Ryatsu. However, because this tree is created from her own Ryatsu, it becomes so used to being fed Ryatsu that any Ryatsu-based attacks that hit it, it actually consumes and uses to grow more. And therefore, if you try to cut down this cage or escape from this cage, it just continues growing faster and faster, making it even harder for you to escape. On top of this, she's also able to generate these branches from her body, which give her an incredible defense from any Ryatsu-based attacks. After her, we have Uetsu, who's the divine general of the south and is known as the god of the sword, the creator of the Zanpakuto. Uetsu has created every Zanpakuto in existence, which is why he was promoted to the royal guard. Well, technically he created the Asauchi, which then turn into the Zanpakuto after they meet the soul of the Soul Reaper that they're supposed to bind. Now for Zanpakuto, Uetsu wields something known as Saifushi, a blade so sharp it can't be held in a sheath, and therefore he has to keep it in a fish tank of jelly-like substance. Now Uetsu plays a massive role in part 2 of Thousand Year Blood War arc, because after all, he was the person who forged Ichigo's true Zanpakuto. See, for those of you who have seen part 1, you'll understand that Ichigo now has a new Zanpakuto, that is a dual-wielding Zanpakuto. Now, the reason that Ichigo now has a true Zanpakuto is kind of complicated, but not that crazy. But the anime and the manga don't do an incredible job of explaining it, so I'm gonna go over it quickly. See, Ichigo's Zanpakuto is Zangetsu. However, Zangetsu has two halves: Old Man Zangetsu and White Zangetsu. Old Man Zangetsu is the manifestation of Ichigo's Quincy powers, because his mother was a Quincy. But White Zangetsu is a manifestation of his Hollow and Soul Reaper abilities. Now, for the majority of the show, Old Man Zangetsu suppresses White Zangetsu, because Old Man Zangetsu was actually technically a manifestation of Yojaba. But the reason that Old Man Zangetsu is in the form of Yojaba is because Yojaba is the progenitor of all Quincy abilities. But this doesn't mean that Old Man Zangetsu and Yojaba are the same person. The reason that Old Man Zangetsu suppresses White Zangetsu is because he wants to keep Ichigo safe. However, once Ichigo realizes there's two halves to Zangetsu, because there's two halves to him, he then is given his true Zanpakuto, which takes the form of two separate blades. Two halves. And once he realizes that Zangetsu was actually just him, he gets his true Zangetsu form, which makes him massively more powerful. And Uetsu allows him to realize this. After Uetsu, we have Senjumaru Shutara. She is the divine general of the north and is known as the Great Weave Guard. Now, Senjumaru created Okin clothing, clothes that allowed the wearer to safely return from the Soul King Palace to the Sarate. And because she created these, she was invited to the Soul King Palace. Because of this, basically all of Senjumaru's abilities revolve around sewing. She has 6 artificial arms attached to her back on top of her 2 actual arms that she uses for needle-based attacks, most specifically cloth manipulation. See, Senjumaru has the ability to create and manipulate any cloth around her, which allow her to do things like sew other people's clothes so that they attack them while they're wearing them, making it so the clothes that you're wearing become a fatal weapon used against you. And she's able to gain control over these clothes faster than even a Stern Ritter can see. On top of this, she can also make incredibly elaborate sewing backdrops that operate in the ways similar to genjutsu. That is to say, she can sew an entire scene that looks like the backdrop that she was standing in front of previous. And thus, let's say hypothetically, you're attacking the Soul King Palace. She can sew a backdrop behind her to make it look like the Soul King Palace is actually somewhere that it isn't, making you attack the sewing backdrop, not the actual Soul King Palace. And because of this, she's known as the 1,000-armed Senjumaru, because she can sew so quickly. Lastly, from the Royal Guard, we have Ichibe, the leader. Now, out of all of the Royal Guard members, we know the most about Ichibe. He is the High Priest of the Royal Guard, also known as the monk who calls the real name. This is because Ichibe is the person who's named everything in the Soul Society: Zanpakuto, Shikai, Bankai, everything. On top of this, he also knows the real name of every Zanpakuto in existence, but can go even further than this, having an ability known as true name manipulation, which allows him to manipulate the true names of objects, giving him complete and total control over their metaphysical form. That is to say, if hypothetically he was to say my name was Ant, I would become as weak as an ant. By controlling our names, he controls what we are. On top of this, should you ever speak his name without being worthy to do so, you will lose your voice, which is ironic when you consider the fact that Ichibe is actually able to recreate his entire body so long as somebody says his name. And when you say his name, he steals power from you and uses that power to recreate his body. On top of this, he also has the ability to manifest his appendages pretty much anywhere he needs them to. And he's able to hit people with these appendages so hard that it sends people flying 1,000 ri away. Now, 1 ri is 2.44 miles, so that's roughly 2,500 miles. Now, the reason that Ichibe was the person to name things like Zanpakuto and Shikai and Bankai is because he was the first to achieve all of them. His Zanpakuto is known as Ichimonji, which is an ink brush that allows him to draw huge calligraphy, and any calligraphy he draws out happens. So if hypothetically he writes hidden on a building, that building will disappear. If he writes seal, a boundary that cannot be passed is created. On top of this, he also has an ability known as name severing. If he's hypothetically able to hit you with a zanpakuto in, let's say, your arm, he's able to make your arm into an R, an AR. Now that the name of your arm is 1/3 shorter, your arm will be 1/3 weaker. Now Ichibe's Shikai release gives his Shikai a special ability known as painted black, where anything hit by his Shikai is painted black and therefore loses its name and therefore its power. And it's powered up by the power of black, so anything that's black around him powers him up. And this ability cannot be used against him, as Ichibe controls all of the black in the universe, which can extend to the black inside of you, like the shadows in your bones and all of your blood. So Ichibe has an ability known as Futen Tai Saturu, which allows him to suck all of the darkness out of an opponent, which completely eviscerates them to the point where they won't even reincarnate. Now Ichibe doesn't technically have a Bankai, he has a Shinuchi, because his Shikai achieved an evolved form before the word Bankai even existed, and his Shinuchi changes his ink from black to white, and if that white ink touches you, he's able to change your name, and if he changes your name to something like Ant, you will become as weak and powerless as an ant. Now these are the royal guard that have been training the likes of Renji, Rukia, and Ichigo, which is why when they all return from the Soul King Palace, they are substantially stronger. In fact, Ichibe plays a massive role in Renji's power-up, as Ichibe actually tells Renji that the name he knows for Zabimaru is only half of Zabimaru's name. And since Ichibe knows all the names of every Zanpakuto in existence, he reveals to Renji what Zabimaru's real name is, which is So-o Zabimaru. So in a very similar capacity to how Ichigo acquires his true Zanpakuto, so does Renji. By training with Ichibe, Rukia is also able to form her own Bankai, which allows her to lower the temperature of her body to absolute 0, which makes her one of the strongest ice users in the universe. However, this Bankai is dangerous for Rukia because she's only able to hold the temperature of absolute 0 for 4 seconds. And if she raises her temperature back up from absolute 0 too quickly, her cells will rupture. But those three aren't the only people who see massive buffs heading into part 2. Captain Hitsugaya learns how to battle with less ice. Suifon figures out Shunko. Sajin figures out how to become human and also technically immortal for a little bit. And also hot. And Kenpachi, after defeating Captain Unohana in a battle, learns the name of his Zanpakuto, Nozarashi, also known as Weather Beaten One. And it's in this part that we see his Zanpakuto released into its Shikai form for its first ever time. And in this Shikai form, there is nothing, and I mean nothing, it cannot cut through. It's actually very similar to Uetsu's Zanpakuto in that regard, though much bigger. And that's pretty much everything you need to know about who gets buffed and how. Unfortunately, Yahuaba won't be that present in part 2, as part 2 is actually more about Yahuaba gaining power than anything, as Yahuaba, when they first attack the Sarate, actually spreads part of his body all across the Sarate, meaning that anybody who dies in the conflict between Stern Raiders and Soul Reapers' soul will actually go to him, empowering him even further. Pretty much all we'll be seeing from Yahuaba is the fact that he is trying to get to the Soul King Palace so he can kill the Soul King, which was technically Aizen's goal. But as for why he wants to kill the Soul King, what his relationship is to the Soul King, or what the Soul King even is, well, that's its own video. All you need to know is Yahuaba does not like him. And with that, that's pretty much everything you need to know heading into part 2. I'm gonna do a separate video on the Soul King and all the information you need to know about the Soul King, but I wouldn't deem knowing anything about the Soul King necessarily important for what we're gonna be seeing in part 2, unless somehow the pacing is faster in part 2 than it is part 1. But since we're gonna be getting some non-manga fights in part 2, I can't imagine we're gonna get to the point where we're dealing with the Soul King in part 2. I think that's gonna be a part 3 final part type thing. But yeah, the Royal Guard's abilities, how Renji, Ichigo, and Rukia get stronger, what Yahuaba's abilities are, what his motivation is, what fights we should expect to see from outside the manga, and what Oryu is up to now that he's joined the Wanderreich, which, by the way, is a whole lot of nothing, at least within part 2. Oryu shows up big in what will be part 3, but we're not there yet. Also, mind you, because this isn't super well explained in the anime or the manga, nobody outside of Oryu knows how Oryu's mother died. I mean, his father knows, but like Ichigo or Hime, Chad, all of them don't know. Oryu's just on demon time in the Wanderreich trying to plot on how to kill Yahuaba when he's not looking. So everyone's gonna be like,
Oryu, come back! What are you doing in the Wanderreich?
but they just don't know that he's there as a spy, but we do. And that's pretty much everything you need to know without heading too heavy into spoiler area. Because while the story does get substantially more plot heavy after chapter 600, I just don't see us getting there. But if you're looking for plot, look out for the Soul King video, because that's going to be much more plot heavy. Oh, and actually, I guess this part is going to be kind of a spoiler, but I'm afraid that the anime isn't going to do a great job explaining it. So if you don't want a possible spoiler, skip to the end of the video. But Urahara, pretty much as fast as Bankais are stolen from all of the captains, begins working on how to get the Bankai back. And Urahara realizes that even though the Wanderreich wanted to capture all of the Arrancar and use their abilities and powers, they couldn't steal their Resurrection, even though Resurrection operates very similarly to a Bankai, which gets Urahara thinking about why wouldn't the Stern Ritters try and steal the Resurrection. And it's at this point that he realizes that hollows are poisonous to Quincy's, which is why Quincy's have decided to not purify hollows but completely destroy them, because Quincy's don't have an antibody against hollow, and therefore Quincy can't even undergo holification like a Shinigami can. The second they begin to holify, their body will just be destroyed and they will die. Therefore, Urahara creates and then distributes a bunch of pills to everybody who has a Bankai. And these pills, when touched, absorb into the Shinigami and slightly holify them and their Zanpakuto, which makes their Bankai and their Shikai poisonous to Quincy. And therefore, since a lot of the Bankai were technically already stolen, any Quincy that was using a Bankai that they stole from a captain or an assistant captain became poisonous to them and they could no longer use it. I'm sure the anime will do an okay job at explaining that, but I want you to be as best prepared for big plot changes as possible, because like I said, they are crushing 5 chapters an episode, so they might just blow through that. And with that, that is everything you need to know heading into part 2 of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. Are you guys excited? Are you dreading to have to switch from Crunchyroll to Hulu to watch it? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I can't even like really put into words like how much part 2 is just a tournament of power between Stern Ritters and Soul Reapers. Like, everybody gets a fight.